If you want to identify the core principles of any belief, theory, or ideology, you'd be on the right track if you sourced your information from its leading thinkers, obviously. So, for example, if you want to discuss the theory of evolution by natural selection, well, Charles Darwin would be your guy. If you want to describe Newtonian physics, well, Isaac Newton. And if you want to describe modern gender theory, or even just the popular notions about gender that we hear enshrined in media narratives, then you should cite people like John Money, who argued that gender is a social construct, or Judith Butler, who said masculine and feminine roles are not biologically fixed but socially constructed, or maybe Dr. Az Hakim, who said gender is a psychosocial virtual entity without location in a person's body. It solely exists and is perpetuated by the society in which the person lives. So, to summarize, they're all arguing that gender is a social convention or a social construct, rather than something grounded in objective or observable reality. And if it doesn't exist outside of our own conventions, then that must mean that we get to define what it is and how it gets applied and how we use it. In the same way that popular Christmas traditions are social conventions. Not to say that the reasons for celebrating Christmas are merely invented, but that the specific characteristics of the festivities, like cards and lights and food, those are all conventions that exist for our own purposes and can just as easily be adapted to different conventions if need be. And because they are conventions, that means that they must be voluntarily participated in. No one should be forced to adopt or participate in any kind of social convention. To impose social conventions on anyone involuntarily would be tyrannical and certainly contrary to the ideals of liberal democracy, which I think is something most of us have bought into. Like, imagine if the government told you that when you gather as a family on Christmas, you have to sing these particular songs together, that you have to eat these particular dishes prepared the way that we tell you, and that you have to marathon like Hallmark Christmas movies all night on Christmas Eve. You'd be right in thinking, that's a violation of our rights. And it's on this basis that gender theorists can argue that traditional notions of gender based on traditional beliefs about the nuclear family, that those are mere social conventions that should not be imposed on people who do not conform to them. This is how we dismantle the Christian paradigm of traditional values in order to instantiate something new and innovative or progressive. Now, I don't agree with that claim, but if that's actually the argument that they're going to rest on, and at least from the sources I've cited above, that seems to be how they're advancing their cause, then they've already shot themselves in the foot. They've already pulled the rug out from under them. They've already sawn off the branch that they were sitting on. I don't know any more ways to say that they've refuted themselves right out of the gate. Because if that's true, if gender is a social convention that is determined by our social preferences, in other words, we invent it and it conforms to whatever vision we impose on the world, and if it's tyrannical to impose a traditional convention on anyone in a liberal democracy, then it's just as tyrannical to impose a progressive notion of gender and sexuality. Conventions and practices inspired by gender theory are, on their own view, social conventions, which is why they have no more grounds to force people to participate in those social conventions by adhering to policies and expectations like reciting gender pronouns. If when I apply for a job or a school, or maybe when I register for an app and it forces me to list my gender pronouns, it's forcing me to participate in what has already been admitted to be a social convention, according to the very same leading thinkers who introduced us to this whole theory about gender, and therefore imposing it on society is as equally tyrannical as imposing the traditional conventions. Again, if you use this claim that gender norms are mere conventions in order to dismantle conservative or traditional notions of gender, then you've also a priori dismantled progressive notions of gender as conventions that cannot be imposed on anyone else. And yet, somehow that's what's happening. We're expected to recognize as objective fact, and not just convention, the preferred pronouns and gender identity of others at work or at school. And there have already been cases in which people have have faced severe consequences for refusing to participate in these new conventions. In the case EN v. Gallagher's Bar and Lounge, the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal ruled that the owner of the bar had to pay significant damages to 3 different employees for not using their they/them pronouns, which, based on what we've already discussed, that's like saying my employer has to throw a Kwanzaa party for me, or I'm going to sue them for not adhering to my preferred social conventions. In Nelson v. Goodberry Restaurant, the BC, that is British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal, rendered a similar decision against a restaurant for not using the pronouns of a former employee. So when they dismantled our traditional recognition of sex as the means by which we identify others by reducing it all to mere conventions, at best they came up with a means of being able to say that people should be allowed to live according to whatever social conventions that they want. And since gender is a social convention, then individuals can choose their own theories about it and live according to those theories. But if that's your argument, what you absolutely cannot do is tell the rest of society that they have to participate in these individualistic notions of gender by affirming those preferences verbally through compelled speech and institutional recognition. We should be able to look at that and say, okay, fine, gender is a social construct, but biological sex is not. Sex is a verifiable fact based on empirical information that anyone can observe. If you dig up a grave in which all the soft tissue has long since disappeared, you can still tell the sex of a person without asking them for their pronouns. Gender is not a necessary fact. It's, as we've all admitted, a social construct, something we invent for our own purposes as a society. It's something we assemble for our own purposes, and therefore it's also something we can disassemble for our own purposes. So if you're going to assemble some theory about gender for your own purposes, I have just as much right to disassemble it for my own purposes and say, I'm not participating in your own peculiar social conventions. But what neither of us can do is say that biological sex isn't a fact, and that the physical reality of sex ought to be conditioned by our social conventions, as if such a thing were even possible. Reality isn't contingent upon us. We are contingent upon reality. And if you don't think so, if you think the laws of gravity are just a convention that we arbitrarily invented and can just as easily recalibrate to suit some other preference, then give it a try. Change the laws of gravity in our textbooks and our engineering manuals and see if we can still fly airplanes. Social conventions are relative to us, but physical reality is not. The laws of physics and biology don't change because of our wishful thinking or our emotional longing. So if someone tells you that you have to have pronouns on your resume or your student application or your email signature, or that your children have to participate in exercises at their publicly funded schools designed to determine what their gender pronouns are, you and I should have every right to say, well, isn't that just a social convention? And if it is, well, it isn't one that I adhere to. So I'm not going to participate in that. And in the same way that you don't have to participate in like my daily rosary. And if they say you have to, well, then you can accuse them of imposing a social convention on you, which is, as they've already admitted, tyrannical. If conservatives can't do it, then neither can progressives. But they are doing it. They're getting people fired, or they're suing them, or worse, for not adhering to their conventions about gender. It's almost as if they believe their whole theory about gender is a fact of reality rather than a mere convention. And if that's what they want to claim, then we have to return back to the condition of treating gender not as a social construct, but something that is factually based in objective reality, and therefore has to meet certain standards of evidence and proof if you want others to recognize it as such. And at that point, the debate is no longer about the imposition of social conventions or making people feel included, but rather which beliefs about sex and gender hold up to rational scrutiny, which one makes more sense and is more grounded in scientific observation and logical reasoning. Because all of those claims about gender being a spectrum and people being born in the wrong body and the need for gender-affirming care and medical intervention, none of these things are observable outside of the feelings or thoughts of those who experience such feelings about themselves. But feelings aren't proof of anything. I have a very strong feeling that I should get 1 million views on my YouTube channel every month. But reality doesn't bend to our feelings no matter how strong they are. And just as I have to accept the fact that I don't get 1 million views on my channel every month, just because one person has certain feelings doesn't mean the rest of society has to affirm those feelings. That gets us back into certain tyrannical impositions, which no liberal democracy should be willing to entertain. But biological sex is observable and empirical. Understanding ourselves according to observable sexuality is a paradigm that has worked for human civilization for as long as there has been human civilization. In fact, we built the most advanced civilization on such traditions. So if it ain't broke, I say we don't fix it. And our attempts to fix it so far seem to have broken a lot of things. So I think we should go back to that tradition that we originally dismantled. Can I ask you to stick around for 1 extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.